They always told us the galaxy was waiting for us to grow up. That's the phrase the Vithori ambassador used when he first stepped onto Earth's soil 7 years ago. Stood right there on the tarmac at the new Nairobi International Spaceport, which we'd built in 11 months, by the way, 11 months from groundbreaking to first docking bay, and looked at our cameras, our crowds, our flags snapping in the Highland wind, and said, with that smooth, translated voice that never quite matched his lip movements, "We have been waiting for your species to grow up." We laughed about it mostly, called it a translation error, called it a cultural misunderstanding. We were generous like that back then. We were the kind of species that gave the benefit of the doubt. That was 7 years ago. I'm sitting here now in the emergency relay station above what used to be the Meridian Summit platform. It's just wreckage now, still sparking in the dark, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened tonight. Not the official version. Not the one the Galactic Council is going to release in 48 hours with all the uncomfortable parts smoothed over. The real one. Because someone has to say it. And because I was there for all of it. My name is Yusuf Ademi. I'm 43 years old. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, in a neighborhood where the power cut out 3 times a week, where you learned to read by the light of whatever was available, and where you also learned because you had to, because there was no other option. That stubbornness was not a personality flaw. It was a survival mechanism. I joined the newly formed United Earth Diplomatic Corps at 26, when the first contact protocols were still being written on paper, actual paper, because nobody trusted the digital archives after the Vithori signal decoded itself on 17 different servers simultaneously and gave everyone a headache that lasted 4 days. I spent 6 years learning Vithori linguistic patterns, Kethar's ceremonial protocols, and the 17 distinct ways the Salan expressed emotional hierarchy through posture alone. I was good at my job. Past tense. I say that not because I've quit, but because after tonight I'm not sure the job still exists in the form I understood it. The Meridian Accords were supposed to be the culmination of 7 years of diplomatic work. 7 years of small rooms and careful language and sitting, across tables from beings who breathed different atmospheres and thought in geometries we didn't have words for yet, trying to find the common ground between our species and 15 others. The Accords would have given Earth formal standing as a Tier 3 civilization in the Galactic Council hierarchy. Not the highest tier, no, we were realistic about that. We weren't going to walk in and demand a seat at the head table, but Tier 3. Full trade rights. Access to medical technology that could eliminate 4 categories of terminal disease. Observation rights at the Galactic Tribunal. The right to speak when spoken to, and sometimes even when not. It was everything we'd worked for. And last night, in the space of about 6 hours, the Vithori Dominion turned it into ash. Not metaphorical ash. I mean that literally. The physical copies of the treaty documents, the ones printed on that ceremonial alloy paper, the ones we'd spent 2 months getting every Earth nation to sign, the ones with the gold seals and the pressed thumbprints of 47 heads of state, are currently drifting in a debris field about 2,000 kilometers above the equatorial belt. Let me tell you how we got there. The Meridian Summit platform was humanity's greatest single engineering achievement. I know people say things like that a lot, and it usually means something was big and shiny and cost a lot of money. But I mean it in a deeper sense. The platform wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a statement. It was Earth saying, "We are serious. We built this for you. We built this to show you that we understand the scale of what we're asking to be part of." The platform was a geostationary structure, anchored 200 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean by a tether system that took 9 years to develop and 3 years to install. It was roughly the size of a small city, 4 square kilometers of pressurized habitation space, 12 distinct atmospheric zones so that every species in attendance could breathe comfortably. a central council chamber with seating for 200 and sight lines designed so that no species had to look up or down at another, because the solicited review of First Contact Protocol had a whole chapter on exactly that kind of subliminal dominance display, and we had read every page of it. We'd thought of everything. Or we'd thought we had. I arrived at the platform 3 days before the summit was scheduled to open. My role was as the senior human liaison, not the lead negotiator. That was Secretary General Priya Chakravarti, who was one of the most quietly formidable people I've ever known, but the person who moved between rooms, smoothed things over, made sure the right people were talking to each other, and the wrong conversations weren't happening where they could cause damage. The platform felt different at full capacity. During the construction phase, I'd visited 6 times, and it had always felt like what it was, a building site, industrial and purposeful and smelling of sealant and recycled air. But 3 days before the summit, with delegations arriving from 12 different systems, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a place where history was supposed to happen. The Kethar delegation arrived first, which was expected. They were punctual to the point of making other species feel judged, and their lead diplomat, Envoy Sarilith, came to find me within an hour of docking. "The human structure is adequate," she said, which from a Kethar was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. "Thank you, Envoy. We're honored you think so. The atmospheric calibration in Zone 7 is 0.003% off standard. I would not mention it, but my junior attaches become irritable at that margin. I got the Zone 7 calibration fixed within 40 minutes. Sarilith didn't acknowledge it, but that was also expected. The Salan arrived that evening, all 17 of them, which was their minimum functional diplomatic unit. They didn't do anything with fewer than 17 because of reasons that took me 2 years to partially understand. And they spent their first 6 hours walking every centimeter of the platform in what looked like total silence, but was apparently a very complex argument conducted entirely below the range of human hearing. The Marlith came in their pressure vessels. The Durindi arrived in a configuration that genuinely alarmed 3 of our junior staff, until someone explained that it was their equivalent of formal attire. And the Grath, well, the Grath sent their standard pre-recorded greeting and confirmed attendance, but didn't actually arrive until the morning of the summit itself, because the Grath were constitutionally incapable of being anywhere on time, and everyone had planned around that. And then on the morning of the second day, the Vethori arrived. I need to explain the Vethori, because you can't understand what happened without understanding who they were and what they represented in the galactic hierarchy. The Vethari Dominion was old. Not the oldest civilization in the Council. That distinction belonged to the Durindi, who had been spacefaring for something like 80,000 years, but old enough to have been present when the current Galactic Council structure was established, which put them about 12,000 years ahead of us. They were what you might call the architects of the current order, not because they designed it consciously, but because their preferences and their history had shaped the rules in ways that still persisted. Physically, the Vethori were. I always struggled with how to describe them to people who'd never seen one in person. Tall, bilaterally symmetrical in the way most tool-using species tended to be, but beyond that the similarities to anything human stopped pretty quickly. Their skin had a quality that changed depending on the light. In direct illumination it appeared a deep blue-black, but in dim conditions it showed iridescent undertones that shifted as they moved. Their faces were arranged differently than ours. The sensory organs were positioned for a wider field of view, and their communication involved both the translated verbal speech we heard through the interpretation systems and a set of physical signals in their skin coloration that we could observe but couldn't read without specialized equipment. They were impressive. There was no point denying that. When a Vethori diplomat walked into a room, the room changed. Ambassador Drathvel was the head of their delegation. He'd been the one on the tarmac 7 years ago, with the growing up comment. I'd spent 7 years in careful professional proximity to Drathvel, and I still couldn't tell you with certainty whether he was contemptuous of humanity or merely accustomed to contempt being the default mode of Vethori interaction with everyone. He arrived with 43 personnel. We'd been told to expect 30. I flagged it. Logistical adjustment, said the Vethori protocol officer when I raised it. The ambassador requires an expanded security presence for a summit of this magnitude. We'd have appreciated advance notice. The atmospheric zones have specific. It has been accommodated, said the protocol officer, in a tone that very clearly communicated that the conversation was over. I made a note, filed it, told myself I was being paranoid. I should have trusted the paranoia. The opening ceremony was set for 09:00 platform standard time on the third day. I'd been awake since 4, going over the sequence one more time with the junior liaison team. There were 23 of us humans on staff for the summit, me, Secretary General Chakravarti, 6 senior diplomats, and a support staff of 16 who'd been selected from among the best people we had. 3 xenolinguists, 4 protocol specialists, 4 communications technicians, and 5 people whose official title was contingency management, and whose actual job was to handle anything that went wrong in real time. We'd rehearsed the contingencies. We had protocols for 7 different categories of diplomatic incident. We had emergency contacts for every species delegation. We had backup translators for backup translators. What we did not have a protocol for was deliberate, premeditated humiliation on a galactic stage. The ceremony began well. That's the maddening thing. The first hour went beautifully. The delegates filed into the Central Council chamber in the agreed order. The order had been negotiated over 4 months, because sequencing of arrival communicated status in Kethar culture, and you didn't get that wrong and took their positions. The chamber was extraordinary, I'll say that even now. The architect had found a way to bring starlight in through a series of channeled viewports, so that the entire ceiling of the chamber was the actual night sky, real stars, unfiltered, and every species in the room could look up and see the same thing. Secretary General Chakravarti gave the opening address. I'd read it 40 times, and I still found myself moved by it. She was a small woman physically. She'd told me once, early in our working relationship, that she'd learned to use that to her advantage, because people underestimated her and then had to recalibrate, which was always an interesting dynamic to observe from the inside. And she stood at the central podium in the council chamber and spoke for 11 minutes about what it meant for Earth to stand here, not as a suppliant, not as a curiosity, but as a civilization, offering something genuine to the community of the galaxy. She didn't say humanity was special. She didn't make that mistake. She said humanity was particular, that we had a specific experience of consciousness and history and failure and survival that no other species had, that this particularity was what we brought to the table, and that we believed the table was richer for every particular voice it held. The Kethar were still. That was their way of showing respect. The Solans shifted in a pattern I recognized as positive resonance. Even the Grath, who had arrived 40 minutes late and hadn't had time to settle in properly, went quiet in a way that felt like attention. And then Ambassador Drathvel stood. He wasn't scheduled to speak until the 3rd session of the day. The protocol was clear. The first session was introductory. The host civilization spoke. The senior representatives of each delegation offered a brief acknowledgement, and then there was a recess for the atmospheric adjustments that several species required during transitions from ship to station environments. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but he stood. And the Vethori protocol, when a senior ambassador of the Dominion stood, was that the room recognized it. Not because the summit rules required it. The summit rules were ours. The platform was ours. the sequencing was ours. But because 12,000 years of galactic habit had created a reflex in every species in the room, and the reflex said, "When a Vethori stands, you yield the floor." Secretary General Chakravarti stopped speaking. I saw it happen, saw the pause, saw her register what was occurring, saw the microsecond of decision on her face, and then she stepped back from the podium. She didn't have to. She absolutely did not have to. But 7 years of training and context and the accumulated weight of what was at stake pressed on her, and she stepped back. That was the first concession. It seemed small, it wasn't. Drathvel's speech lasted 47 minutes. I timed it. I was standing in the secondary observation area behind the main delegates gallery, and I watched the timer on my wristband, and I timed every minute of it. He spoke about the history of the Galactic Council. He spoke about the standards for tier admission. He spoke about the Vethori Dominion's central role in establishing those standards. He spoke, and this is where I felt the first real chill of something wrong, about the particular challenges faced by young civilizations integrating into established galactic frameworks, about the tendency of such civilizations to overestimate their readiness, about the historical precedents for tier admission being delayed or modified when the evaluation process revealed gaps in what he called civilizational maturity. None of it was addressed to Earth directly. None of it was openly hostile. Every sentence was constructed with enough diplomatic deniability that you could read it as informational, even as helpful. But I've spent 17 years learning how language works across species, and I know what it sounds like when someone is talking about you while maintaining the polite fiction that they aren't. The other delegates heard it too. I could see the Kethar envoy Sarilith in my sightline. She was doing the absolute stillness thing again, but a different quality of stillness, the kind that comes from a decision being made internally rather than respect being offered externally. The Solon were resonating in a minor pattern I hadn't seen from them before and needed a moment to identify. It took me about 30 seconds, cross-referencing against training materials I hadn't consulted in 4 years. It was the Solon pattern for witnessing something uncomfortable. Drathvel finished, sat down. The room was quiet for a beat too long, one of those pauses that has a color to it, a weight that you can feel on your skin. Secretary General Chakravarti returned to the podium. Her expression was composed. She was a professional to her core, and nothing on her face gave away what I could see was happening just underneath it. "We thank Ambassador Drathvel for his thoughtful historical context," she said, smooth, unflappable. "We will move now to the acknowledgement sequence, beginning with Envoy Sarilith of the Kethar Concordat." It should have moved on. It was supposed to move on. Instead, one of Drathvel's junior attaches, not the ambassador himself, a junior attaché, which was a specific and deliberate choice, stood and said, in the translated common voice so every species in the room could hear, "The Vethori Dominion requests an additional procedural clarification before the acknowledgement sequence." There was no provision for this in the agenda. There was no provision for any unscheduled interventions before the acknowledgement sequence. The agenda had been negotiated, approved, and signed by every delegation, including the Vethori. "This is not the appropriate time for procedural clarifications," said Secretary General Chakravarti, still smooth, still composed. "We invite the Dominion to submit any procedural questions to the Joint Liaison Committee, which convenes at." "The clarification concerns the validity of the summit agenda itself," said the attaché. The room went very still. I moved. I was already moving, pushing through to the communications panel at the back of the secondary gallery, because I knew before the attaché finished the sentence, that this was not a procedural question. This was the opening move of something we hadn't been briefed on and hadn't anticipated and needed to understand in the next approximately 90 seconds if we were going to have any chance of managing it. I got to the panel, pulled up the Vethori delegation's filed pre-summit documentation. There were 43 personnel on the official list, all flagged as diplomatic or support staff. I cross-referenced against the Galactic Council's public registry of Vethori personnel. 26 of the 43 listed names did not appear in the public registry. I stared at the screen for a second that felt longer than it was. 26 names, not in the registry, which meant they weren't diplomats, weren't support staff, weren't anything the Vethori had officially told us they were. I opened a secure channel to our security lead, a former military officer named Tamaz Reyes, who I trusted with my life because I'd had occasion to, once, under circumstances I won't go into here. Tamaz, immediate review. 26 Vethori personnel on the platform are unregistered. I need eyes on their current positions. There was a pause of about 4 seconds. Then, Yusuf, you need to see something. What? The unregistered personnel. They're not in the accommodation zones. Where are they? Another pause. They're at the communications relays, all 4 of them. I need to stop here for a moment and tell you what the communications relays meant. The platform was, by design, one of the most connected structures humanity had ever built. We'd wanted the summit to be globally broadcast, wanted every human being on Earth to be able to watch in real time as humanity took this step. 4 relay towers distributed around the platform's outer structure managed all communications traffic in and out. The global broadcast feed, the Galactic Council's encrypted session recording, the internal platform networks, and the emergency beacon systems. If you controlled the relays, you controlled everything that went in or out of the platform. I didn't say anything to Tamaz for 3 seconds. I was running probabilities, outcomes, responses. Get them away from the relays, I said, politely, but get them away. Working on it, but Yusuf, there's something else. Say it. The external docking bay, Bay 9. The Vethori docked a secondary vessel there 40 minutes ago. I have it on record. It's bigger than anything on their registered manifest. The classification on its hull markings is. He said the Vethori word, and I recognized it immediately, because I'd spent 3 weeks specifically studying Vethori vessel classifications in preparation for this summit. The word was for a military command ship, not a diplomatic vessel, not a courier. A military command ship, carrying Vethori Dominion naval armament, was docked in Bay 9 of the Meridian Summit platform. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second, then I opened them and said, "Get me the Secretary General, now. And Tamaz, do not let anyone board from that ship." I'm going to compress the next 40 minutes because telling them in real time would take 4 hours, and the emotional texture of every individual moment would likely destroy whatever composure I've been managing to hold together while recording this. Here is what happened. The Vethori procedural challenge was an elaborate piece of theater. The attaché who stood to deliver it had been briefed to be long-winded, technical, and impossible to interrupt without creating a diplomatic incident. Because the Vethori had researched our summit protocols extensively and identified the specific provisions under which an interruption would reflect badly on the host civilization. So they stood there and talked. And while they talked, the 26 unregistered personnel held position at the communications relays. What we didn't know, what I found out approximately 19 minutes into the procedural challenge, was that the unregistered personnel weren't just holding position. They were doing something to the relays. Specifically, they were installing what Tamaz's team eventually identified as a Vethori communications architecture override, a device that, once active, would reroute all outgoing signals from the platform through Vethori encryption protocols. Everything we transmitted from that point on would go through them first. At minute 22, Tamaz's people reached the communications relays and found the Vethori personnel already gone, moved, slipped away through corridors we hadn't been watching because we'd been focused on the council chamber. And the devices they'd installed were active. At minute 27, the procedural challenge concluded and the Vethori attaché sat down. A small smile on his face, small, but I was watching closely, and it was there. At minute 31, Ambassador Drathvel stood again. This time, what he said was not dressed up in historical context or diplomatic language. This time, he said, in common voice, recorded on the Galactic Council's official summit log, transmitted to every connected system in the galactic network through the rerouted relay infrastructure. This time, he said that the Vethori Dominion was withdrawing its support for Earth's Tier 3 application. He said that a review conducted by Dominion analysts had identified what he called systemic indicators of civilizational instability in humanity's recent history. He cited the same conflicts, the same failures, the same wounds that humans had been trying and partially succeeding to heal, and he laid them out, one by one, in a room full of delegates from 15 other species, in a transmission going out to every connected system in the galaxy. He said that the Vethori Dominion's position was that Earth was not ready. And then, and this is the part I still can't say out loud without something in me going very quiet and very still, he said that the platform itself, as a structure built within what the Vethori considered their territorial expansion zone, was in violation of a mapping provision that we hadn't been informed existed. That the Meridian Summit platform was, according to Vethori territorial claims filed 6 months ago with the Galactic Council, filed quietly, without announcement, updated to include new coordinates that happened to match the platform's precise geostationary position in contested space, which meant, under Galactic Council emergency protocols, that the platform's legal status as sovereign human territory was suspended pending territorial resolution, which meant that the treaties signed on this platform, including the Meridian Accords themselves, were potentially non-binding. The room didn't erupt. That's what you might expect: eruption, noise, chaos. But that's a human response to shock. The species in that room had different responses. The Kethar went absolutely rigid. The Salan vibrated at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. The Durindi dimmed their bioluminescent surface, just dimmed, like a light going out. And the humans in the room, 23 of us, against 43 Vethori, and a platform we could no longer trust the communications infrastructure of, went very, very quiet. Secretary General Chakravarti stood at the podium for 3 seconds without speaking. 3 seconds that felt in that room like 3 hours. Then she said very calmly, "The session is in recess, 45 minutes. And she walked off the podium with her back straight and her chin level and went directly to the secure consultation room, and I followed her, and the door closed behind us, and she sat down in the nearest chair and put her hands flat on the table and stared at them for about 15 seconds. Then she looked up at me and said, 'Tell me everything.' I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. 'The territorial filing,' she said, 'when was it submitted?' 6 months ago, before we announced the summit location. They knew where we were going to build it. We announced the location 14 months ago. So they had 8 months to make the filing after our announcement, and they chose to do it before we announced." She paused. "Which means the filing predated the announcement. Which means they decided we were going to build here before we decided it ourselves. Which means the intelligence penetration goes further back than 6 months." She took a long breath. "Or they dictated the location through someone in our selection committee." I didn't say anything to that. There were things that could wait. "What do we do?" I asked instead. She looked at me with an expression that I'd learned over 8 years of working with her. meant she was about to say something that sounded simple but wasn't. "We continue the summit," she said. I want to dwell on that decision for a moment, because I think it's important, and I think history, if it's recorded honestly, which is never guaranteed, should understand what Secretary General Priya Chakravarti was choosing when she said those three words. We could have ended the summit. We had grounds, legitimate grounds. The Vithori had violated the summit agenda, introduced unregistered personnel, installed unauthorized communications equipment, and made what was essentially a hostile move against the platform's territorial status, all in the first 3 hours of a 7-day summit. Every legal precedent in Galactic Council jurisprudence would have supported an immediate adjournment pending investigation. We also would have lost. Not in the legal sense, in the sense that mattered, because the Vithori transmission had already gone out through their rerouted relay system to every connected network in the galaxy. Every Galactic Council member had already received a transmission from the Vithori Dominion, in official Dominion diplomatic format, stating that Earth was unstable and unready. If we adjourned, the narrative that would solidify in the galactic consciousness was the one Drathvel had just delivered. "We continue," said Chakravarti, "and we change nothing about our approach. We don't get defensive, we don't counterattack, we don't make statements about the territorial filing because we haven't verified it fully yet, and unverified counterstatements will hurt us more than silence. We go back in that room, and we do exactly what we came here to do. They control the outgoing transmissions. Then we make sure what happens in that room is worth transmitting." I looked at her for a long moment. "You know what they're going to do next?" "I have some ideas." "They're going to escalate." "Yes." "The military vessel." "I know about the military vessel, Yusuf." She stood up. "I've known about it for a week." I went very still. "I didn't tell you," she said, "because I needed your reactions in that room to be genuine. I'm sorry. That was a decision I made, and I'll answer for it when this is over." She smoothed her jacket. "The Vithori think we're managing a crisis. They think we're frightened and scrambling and trying to contain damage. That's what they've engineered this entire situation to produce. And we're not." She almost smiled, almost. "We're not frightened," she said. "We're angry. There's a difference. And there's one other thing we are that they've completely miscalculated." "What?" "Prepared." She walked back into that council chamber like she'd simply stepped out for a glass of water. I've thought about that walk many times since. The distance from the secure consultation room to the council chamber podium was maybe 60 meters, through 2 corridors and a pressure lock. She covered it at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberate, just the natural pace of a person going somewhere because that's where they need to be. No visible tension, no performance of calm, just actual, inhabited calm. The delegates had barely moved during the recess. That's something I noticed under normal circumstances. A 45-minute recess would have produced a lot of movement, small conversations, the species-specific rituals of taking a break from formal proceedings. But the council chamber was almost preternaturally still when we walked back in. Everyone was watching. Not performing watching, actually watching, the way you watch when you're trying to understand something. Chakravarti took the podium. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "Before we continue with the scheduled agenda," she put a specific weight on scheduled, not heavy, just present, "I'd like to take a moment to speak directly to an observation that Ambassador Drathvel raised." The Vithori delegation was motionless. Drathvel's skin coloration had shifted. The iridescent undertones were doing something I would have needed equipment to properly read, but which looked, to my untrained eye, like something between curiosity and surprise. He hadn't expected her to address it directly. "The ambassador raised the question of whether humanity is ready," said Chakravarti. "It's a fair question. I want to be clear about that. It is genuinely a fair question, and I would rather address it honestly than pretend it hasn't been asked." She paused. In the chamber, the only sound was the faint whisper of the atmospheric systems. 7,000 years ago, she said, the Vethori Dominion fought a war among its own member systems that lasted 400 years and resulted in the extinction of 3 indigenous subspecies and the complete ecological collapse of 11 planetary environments. I mention this not as an accusation, but as context. Every civilization in this room has a history. Every civilization that achieved the tier standing they now hold did so carrying the weight of that history. We don't ask you to be ashamed of it. We don't cite it as evidence of your unworthiness. She let that land for exactly 1 second. We ask only the same courtesy. The sullen pattern shifted. It took me a moment to identify the new configuration. When I did, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was the sullen pattern for attention given in full respect. "But I want to address the specific question," said Chakravarti, "because Ambassador Drathvel asked it, and it deserves a real answer. Is humanity ready?" She took a breath. 200 years ago, humanity was burning its own planet and killing itself with the tools it had invented. 50 years ago, we were still figuring out how to keep enough people alive that we could afford to spend resources on looking up. 20 years ago, the concept of united Earth was theoretical, not in the sense that we hadn't tried, but in the sense that the trying kept failing. She wasn't looking at Drathvel. She was looking at the room, sweeping her gaze across every delegation, making contact with each in turn, using the appropriate form of acknowledged attention for each species because she knew them. She'd spent years learning them. "What changed," she said, "was not that we became perfect. We are not perfect. What changed was that we decided that the cost of our imperfection was no longer acceptable to us. Not because someone told us to, not because someone else's standard required it, because we looked at each other and decided we were worth the effort." She paused again. That decision, the internal, chosen decision of a species to do better not for external reward, but because it matters, may be the most civilizational thing humans have ever done. And I would respectfully suggest that it is not a symptom of unreadiness. It is evidence of exactly the kind of readiness that cannot be manufactured, cannot be evaluated on a tier application form, and cannot be understood by examining our failures in isolation. The room was very quiet. "We are ready," said Chakravarti. "We're going to demonstrate it for you over the next 6 days, and then you're going to decide. That's how this is supposed to work, and that's exactly how it's going to work." She stepped back from the podium. An envoy Seralith of the Kethar Concordat, who had not moved in 3 hours, who had maintained the stillness of deep respect and deep attention, touched the edge of her table with the tips of 3 fingers. In Kethar protocol, I had to search back through my memory to be sure, but I was sure. 3 fingers to the table edge was the gesture of witnessed endorsement. It was the Kethar equivalent of applause. The next 4 hours were the most exhausting of my professional life, and I have survived diplomatic sessions that lasted 30 hours with no food breaks, and one memorable incident involving a Grath translator having a medical crisis in the middle of a sensitive negotiation. So I have a reasonably calibrated sense of what exhausting means. Ambassador Drathvel did not look rattled by Chakravarti's address. He probably wasn't, in any deep sense. The Vethori had not come to the summit prepared to be moved by a human speech. But something had shifted in the room's orientation, and I think he registered that, because the Vethori's next move was different from what I'd expected. I'd expected another procedural intervention, another public display, something designed to humiliate or unsettle. What actually happened was quieter, and in many ways more dangerous. During the first substantive session, which was supposed to cover Earth's formal tier application review, the documents, the submitted evidence, the standardized evaluation metrics, the Vethori legal attaches began raising objections. not to the application itself, but to the process. Specific, technical objections to the format of individual submitted documents, the specific Galactic Council subsection under which each piece of evidence was filed, the precise wording of the application's cover certification. Every objection was technically valid. That was the thing. Every single one was grounded in an actual provision of Galactic Council procedural code. Obscure provisions that existed in subsections that applied to very specific edge cases, but real provisions, consulted by Vethori legal staff who had clearly spent months preparing this exercise. Each objection required a response. Each response required consultation with our legal team. Each consultation took time. The Vethori had calculated, correctly, that if you generate enough technically valid objections to a process, you can grind it to a halt without ever technically obstructing it. Our legal team was 3 people. The Vethori legal attaches were 9. By the 3rd hour of the session, we'd addressed 17 objections and cleared 11 of them. The other 6 were still in active consultation. We were behind schedule by 2 hours. The delegates from other species were sitting in a room watching what looked, if you didn't understand the specifics, like exactly the kind of procedural fumbling that Drathvel had suggested was characteristic of civilizational unreadiness. I left the chamber and went to find Nadia Volkov. Nadia was one of our 5 contingency managers. She was 29 years old. She completed dual doctorates in xenolegal frameworks and computational linguistics at 25, and she had a quality I'd identified in her interview, and that had been confirmed every day since. She thought 3 moves ahead without appearing to. I found her in the secondary support hub, already surrounded by screens. "I see it," she said before I could speak. "Procedural attrition strategy. They've been preparing the objection list for at least 4 months based on the document submission patterns. How many more do they have?" She glanced at a screen. "My estimate, between 30 and 50, enough to consume the entire session calendar if we address each one individually." "So we don't." She turned to look at me. "We file an omnibus procedural legitimacy challenge. One response addressing all outstanding and anticipated objections simultaneously, filed under Council Code 7.14, which allows a host civilization to present a consolidated procedural affirmation when it believes objections are being raised in a pattern inconsistent with the spirit of good faith review." I stared at her. "That provision exists in a subsection that's never been invoked because it requires 3 supporting co-signatory delegations. And we have." She almost smiled. "I've been talking to Envoy Sarilith for the last 90 minutes. The Kethar Wilkasing. The Salin primary speaker confirmed 12 minutes ago. I'm waiting on one more." "Which one?" "I've sent a formal request to the Durindi delegation. They haven't responded yet." She looked at the screen again. "But the Durindi senior presence has moved from their accommodation zone toward the council chamber. That's the Durindi equivalent of active engagement." "How do you know that?" "I put biosensors in the corridor." I looked at her. "Passive atmospheric monitors," she said, "completely within regulation. I filed the installation permit 6 weeks ago." I made a mental note to give Nadia Volkov whatever she asked for at the next personnel review, and went back to the chamber. The Durindi Kasan 20 minutes later. The omnibus procedural affirmation was filed at 14:47 Platform Standard Time. Under Council Code 7.14, the Vethori's outstanding objections were suspended pending a joint review that would not, by provision of the same code, delay the substantive session proceedings. The Vethori legal team went very still. Drathvel's skin undertone shifted through 3 configurations in rapid succession. And the substantive session continued. I don't want to make it sound like we'd won anything at that point. We hadn't. We bought time and maintained forward momentum, which was genuinely significant, but the Vethori still had the military vessel in Bay 9. They still had the communications relay override in place. They still had the territorial filing that threatened the platform's legal status. And they still had the opening transmission that had gone out to the galactic network, framing humanity as unstable and unready. None of that had changed. What had changed was that 4 other species delegations, the Kethar, the Salan, the Durindi, and quietly the Marlith, who had sent a very brief coded message to our liaison desk that translated roughly as "the Marlith observe with interest and will not oppose," had made visible, registered, official gestures of support. Small ones, procedural ones, but visible. In galactic politics, visible matters more than you'd think. Night fell on Earth below us. I watched it through the viewport in the secondary hub, the Terminator line, the edge of shadow moving across the surface, the lights of cities coming on in sequence the way they always did, billions of people going about their evenings, most of them aware the summit was happening, some of them watching the feed that was now going out through Vethori-filtered relays, none of them knowing exactly what we were dealing with up here. I thought about Lagos, the power cuts, the reading by whatever light was available, the stubbornness that wasn't a flaw. At 21:00 Platform Standard Time, the Vethori made their next move. Ambassador Drathvel formally requested an emergency session. His stated reason was new information relevant to the tier application review, specifically what he called independently verified evidence of ongoing Earth governance failures that he wished to present to the full Council. Under standard procedure, a request for an emergency session from a senior delegation had to be honored within 2 hours. "What do we know about this evidence?" Chakravarti asked. Tamaz answered, "We intercepted a Vethori internal communication 40 minutes ago, partially encrypted, but enough came through to get the shape of it." He put a data file on the table between us. "They've compiled a package, 3 parts. Part 1 is a curated selection of global news from the past 12 months, conflicts, political crises, environmental incidents. Selective and out of context, but technically factual. Part 2 is an analysis piece, attributed to an independent galactic research institute, concluding that Earth's governance integration is below Tier 3 standard. Part 3, he paused. "Say it," said Chakravarti. "Part 3 is a recording, intercepted communications from inside the United Earth Council, private discussions, disagreements among member nations about elements of the summit strategy." He looked up from the file. "They have a source inside the council, have had for a while." The room was quiet. "The recording," said Chakravarti carefully, "is it accurate?" "As far as we can tell, yes. It's real footage, real conversations." "Embarrassing." "Yes, some of it, yes." She nodded slowly. "So they're going to stand up in front of the Galactic Council in 2 hours and show everyone that we argue with each other. That's the plan as far as we can read it. That we have internal disagreements. Yes. That different Earth nations have different perspectives on strategy. Yes." Chakravarti was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Call the emergency session." I frowned. "We don't have to. Under Code 7.14, the emergency session request can be reviewed." "Call it," she said, "and I need 45 minutes before it opens." She left the room. I found out later where she went. She went back to her private quarters, and she spent 45 minutes making calls. Personal calls, on an Earth internal encrypted channel that didn't go through the platform relay system, because she'd had an independent satellite link installed as a contingency 6 months ago and never mentioned it to anyone except Tamaz, who had installed it himself. She called 7 heads of state. When the emergency session opened at 23:00 PST, Secretary General Chakravarti was at the podium. The full council was seated. The Vethori delegation was arranged with what I'd learned to read as the Vethori configuration for confident expectation. Drathvel stood, presented the evidence package, the curated news footage, the research analysis, the intercepted council recordings. He spoke for 22 minutes. It was, I'll give him this, effective. The news footage was genuinely distressing, even for those of us who lived with it. You don't become immune to seeing your home world's worst moments just because you know the context. The research analysis was framed with the specific kind of authoritative neutrality that reads as objective truth to any species that doesn't know who funded the research institute that produced it. And the recordings. The recordings were real. Real voices, real disagreements, real moments of frustration and uncertainty from inside the United Earth Council. The Korean bloc arguing with the Atlantic Federation about timeline. The South American Assembly expressing doubts about the atmospheric zone specifications. The African Union representative saying, in a moment of private exasperation, "Sometimes I think we're trying to run before we can walk." I watched the council delegates as the recordings played, watched their faces and their bodies and their configurations, reading what I could, guessing at what I couldn't. Then Drathvel concluded and Chakravarti said, "Thank you, Ambassador." She turned to the council. "What you've just seen," she said, "is humanity, real humanity, not the curated version. Yes, we argue. Yes, we doubt ourselves. Yes, there are moments when individuals within our governing structure lose confidence and say so out loud." She paused. "I'm going to show you something else." She touched the podium's control surface. On the main display, not through the Vethori relay system, but through the independent satellite channel, feeding directly to the Galactic Council's independent archive, appeared a live feed. 43 cities, simultaneously. New Nairobi, Lagos, London, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Mumbai, Toronto, Cairo, Sydney, Beijing, Jakarta, Los Angeles, Moscow, Karachi, Istanbul, Buenos Aires, Seoul, Bogota, Baghdad, Dhaka. The streets, the night markets and the commuter trains and the hospitals and the schools running late programs for working parents. Real people, unperformed, not staged, living. We sent Earth News to every city with a connected public broadcast infrastructure 3 hours ago, said Chakravarti, and asked if anyone wanted to show the galaxy what an ordinary Tuesday night looks like where they live. We got feeds from 43 cities inside 90 minutes. She let the feeds play for 40 seconds. 40 seconds of Earth, messy, imperfect, noisy, alive, funny, tired, ongoing, stubborn, human Earth. "We have internal disagreements," she said. "We have political friction. We have individuals who doubt the process. And we continue anyway. We build anyway. We show up anyway." She looked at the Vethori delegation. "The ambassador is correct that we are not a perfect civilization. No civilization in this room is. The question before this council is not whether Earth is perfect. The question is whether Earth is good enough to be part of this community and serious enough to be trusted with the responsibilities that come with it. We believe the answer is yes. We leave that determination to you." She stepped back. The council was quiet for a long time. And then Envoy Saralith spoke. She said, in the precise, careful formal language of Kethar Concordat diplomatic address, "The Kethar Concordat registers a formal objection to the methods by which the evidence just presented to this council was obtained." Drathvel went still in a way I'd never seen before, a different kind of still. "Specifically," continued Saralith, "the Kethar Concordat notes that the intercepted communications presented as evidence were obtained via what appears to be a covert intelligence operation conducted on sovereign human territory, which under Galactic Council Resolution 114b constitutes a violation of non-interference protocols binding on all member civilizations." The room had changed again. I could feel it, not metaphorically, but actually in the atmospheric quality of the space, in the physical orientation of every body in it. The Kethar Concordat further notes, said Saralith, that the communications relay modification observed on this platform during today's proceedings has not been addressed. The Kethar Concordat calls for an immediate Galactic Council technical review of all transmission activity through the platform relays for the duration of today's sessions. She sat down, 3 fingers to the table edge. The Solon primary speaker made the resonance pattern that meant endorsed. And the Durindi, who had not made a verbal contribution to a session in 11 years of Galactic Council proceedings, whose senior presence communicated exclusively through the formal written document submissions that were their tradition. The Durindi senior presence touched the table with the specific luminescent contact that their species used for what translated, roughly, as the record should show this. The record would show this. The next hour was not a triumph. I want to be clear about that, because this story doesn't have a clean arc. The Vethori didn't collapse. The territorial filing didn't vanish. The military vessel in Bay 9 didn't suddenly become innocuous. The transmission that had gone out to the galactic network at the beginning of the day, framing humanity as unstable and unready, was still out there, already received, already processed by whatever media and political and analytical systems existed across the galaxy's connected civilizations. What the next hour was a reckoning. 3 more delegations registered formal concerns about Vethori methodology. The Galactic Council's independent technical team was granted access to the platform relays over Vethori objection, which was registered but overruled on a preliminary procedural vote by 7-3, and began the process of documenting what had been installed and by whom. Ambassador Drathvel addressed the Council one more time. His address was shorter than his previous ones, and more careful, and toward the end of it a quality entered his translated voice that I hadn't heard before. Not quite defensiveness, not quite uncertainty, something between the two that I didn't have the right Vethori vocabulary to name. He said that the Vethori Dominion stood by the substance of its concerns regarding Earth's tier readiness, while acknowledging that certain methodological questions arising from today's proceedings warranted review through appropriate council channels. Which was, in diplomatic language, a very careful statement that said nothing directly while maneuvering away from a position that had become untenable. At 01:47 Platform Standard Time, the Vethori military vessel in Bay 9 departed. It left without announcement, without filing a departure record, without requesting clearance, a violation of platform docking protocol that Tamaz documented meticulously. At 02:15, the technical team completed their relay inspection and confirmed the unauthorized installation. The devices were removed. Our communications architecture was restored. At 03:30, Secretary General Chakravarti and I sat in the secondary hub, both of us running on adrenaline and the last reserves of whatever kept professionals functional, past the point of reasonable endurance, and she told me what she'd told the 7 heads of state in her 45-minute preparation period before the emergency session. She told them to be honest with the people watching. She told the Brazilian president to address her nation directly before the emergency session began, and tell them that the summit was facing challenges, that there were forces in the galaxy that preferred Earth remain in a subordinate position, and that the best thing Brazilians could do in that moment was to be exactly themselves, ordinary, living human. She told the mayor of Lagos to get a camera crew into the night markets and just film. She told the city administrators of Tokyo and Mumbai and Dhaka and Cairo, just show us what tonight looks like. She'd bet, and it was a bet. She was clear about that. It might not have worked. The council might have seen the footage and found it evidence of the very chaos the Vethori were pointing to. She'd bet that the best argument for humanity being ready for the galaxy Was humanity being human without apology or performance? Did it work? I asked. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Ask me in 6 months, she said, when the council votes. The Meridian Summit continues. As of this recording, we are 8 hours into a 7-day proceeding, and we have so far survived, with our delegation intact and our application still on the table, a premeditated Vethori campaign to humiliate us in front of the galaxy, compromise our communications infrastructure, undermine our platform's territorial status, use illegally obtained intelligence to depict us as unstable, and convince our potential galactic allies that we weren't worth the investment of their support. We are still here. The treaties are not in flames. That's the other thing history needs to know if this account survives. The phrase that's been circulating in the early reports, every treaty was in flames, is, I think, what the Vethori wanted. They wanted it to look like that. They constructed the evening specifically to produce that image. Burned bridges, collapsed agreements, humanity exposed as not yet capable of playing at this level. What actually burned tonight was the credibility of the approach. Not ours, theirs. The Galactic Council has procedures for everything, and one of the things it has procedures for is what happens when a senior member civilization is documented to have used intelligence penetration, territorial manipulation, unauthorized communications override, and a military vessel deployment to influence a membership application proceeding. Those procedures are slow, they're council procedures. They'd have to be, but they exist, and they've been invoked before, and the Vethori legal team knows the provisions as well as anyone. The Kethar formal objection and the technical team's documented findings are in the official record. The vote on the omnibus procedural affirmation is in the record. The Durindi luminescent contact notation is in the record. The record exists. And the 43 city feeds. Those are in the record too, permanently archived in the Galactic Council's independent system, independent of the relay infrastructure, independent of Vethori access. 43 cities showing an ordinary Tuesday night on Earth. I think when the historians eventually look at today, and I hope they look at it with more generosity than this account probably deserves, because I know I've missed things and got things wrong and told this with the bias of someone who was in the middle of it. I think the thing they'll note is not the Vethori operation, not even Chakravarti's response, but that moment. 43 cities, 90 minutes. Nobody told those cities what to put on camera. Nobody scripted it. Nobody managed the image. Lagos filmed its night markets because that's what Lagos is at night, noise and food and commerce and argument and laughter at 1 in the morning. Tokyo filmed its commuters because that's what Tuesday night looks like there. Dhaka filmed a school and the parents waiting outside and the kids coming out to them. Nobody told them to be wonderful, they just were. If that's not Tier 3, I don't know what is. There's one more thing I want to record, because I think it matters and I don't know if anyone else will include it in the official account. At approximately 04:00 PST, about 15 minutes ago as I speak this, I was walking back from the secondary hub toward my quarters when I passed the observation corridor on the platform's outer ring. The one with the full viewport, floor to ceiling, facing the planet. Ambassador Drathvel was there, standing at the viewport, alone without any of his delegation's personnel, looking at Earth. I almost kept walking, then I stopped. He heard me. The Vethori hearing range is wider than human. He would have registered my footsteps before I turned the corner, but he didn't move. He kept looking at the planet below us. I walked to the viewport and stood next to him, not close, a respectful distance, and I looked at Earth too. We stood there for maybe 2 minutes without speaking. Then Drathvel said, not in the formal translated common voice of the council chamber, but in a quieter mode, the Vethori register that the interpreter systems told me was used for non-official speech. You built this platform in 11 months. 14, I said, from groundbreaking to first docking bay. 14, he said, a pause. My homeworld's most complex construction of the pre-expansion era took 60 years. I didn't say anything to that. You are dangerous, said Drathvel. He said it very carefully, like a thought being turned over. Not in the way that is usually meant by the word. You are dangerous in the specific sense that you change the context around you. You come into a situation, and the situation is different after you have been in it. Is that why? I started. Yes, he said, that is why. He didn't look away from Earth. The Dominion has maintained its position in this council for 11,000 years, he said. The position is not merely political. It is structural. The way the galaxy thinks about itself. The way the council understands the order of things. When a new voice enters the structure changes, I said. A long pause. The structure changes, he agreed. I let the silence stay for a moment. It was going to change anyway, I said, whatever you did tonight. He didn't respond to that. We're out here, I said. We know you're out here. There's no version of the next 100 years where Earth is not part of this conversation. The only question is what kind of part. He was quiet for a long time. Earth turned below us, slow and blue-white and brilliant. The Kethar registered the formal objection tonight, he said. The Salon endorsed it. The Durindi made notation. Yes. That has not happened before, not to the Dominion. No, I said. He was quiet again. Your Secretary General, he said. She is remarkable. Yes, I said, she is. I left him there at the viewport, looking at the planet. I don't know how the vote goes. I want to be clear about that. I have no idea. 7 years of work and the most consequential night of my professional career, and I genuinely do not know how it ends. The council will deliberate. The Vethori territorial filing will be reviewed. The documented procedural violations will be assessed. The 43 city feeds will sit in the archive. And humanity will do what humanity does. We'll keep showing up. We'll keep building things in 14 months that should take 60 years. We'll keep arguing with ourselves in recorded communications and then showing up to the table anyway. We'll keep filming our night markets and our late school pickups and our ordinary Tuesday evenings and transmitting them to the stars. We'll keep being the species that looks at a galaxy that isn't sure we're ready and says, "Watch us." I've been awake for 23 hours. The summit has 6 days and 16 hours left on its calendar. The Vethori delegation is still on the platform, as is their right under council protocols. And tomorrow morning, we will all walk back into the council chamber and continue the proceedings with the politeness and precision that the situation requires. But tonight something changed. I don't know exactly what. I don't have the vocabulary for it in any of the 17 languages I've studied. It's something in the way the council chamber felt after Sarilith put 3 fingers to the table. Something in the way the Durindi senior presence made their luminescent contact. Something in the way 43 cities answered a call inside 90 minutes. Something in the way an 11,000-year-old civilization's ambassador stood at a viewport at 4 in the morning and looked at a planet he'd been trying to diminish and couldn't quite look away. The galaxy didn't break us tonight. And by dawn, the only thing in flames was the idea that we could be.